Want to skip ads without hurting my inner child? Head over to patreon.com/CMC and help fund the show. Today, we're looking at bourbon. We're not going to even drink. We're just going to be bourboning. That's our deal. This is Kurt.
I've been bobbing the bourboning.
Right. Kurt, why? You're like so big. You're just right up here, being all like big.
It's the McDonald's I had before I got here.
Well, today, bourbon is going to be on the menu. I might pull out some glasses to drink.
Couldn't we have picked a better name for our national spirit than bourbon?
Bourbon. Why?
I don't know. I think
it's got dust on it. It is kind of it doesn't make any. It's kind of like.
I'll explain the whole thing.
It's dark and it feels like it's old.
I know. It has a purpose.
Because is it a language?
No. It'll all make sense very, very soon, young Skywalker.
All right. So the goal today is to educate people on different styles of bourbon. We're not going to drink all kinds of bourbon because we don't have all kinds of bourbon. It's one of the only, I think, segments aside from cognac that we could do that I don't have a big representation of.
Yeah, I mean, it's not important. What we're going to do is this 1 week, because I just started my new job, is getting all of the educational stuff for the month of, this will be October?
Yeah.
Yeah, every Monday in October we'll cover the very last of the educational portions that I haven't covered yet. So if you go back and you do the search, we have gin.
Yep.
We've done scotch.
Yep.
We've done...
rum. No, we didn't do scotch. The scotch, I don't remember if we really did scotch.
Yeah, we did scotch. It was explained, and then we just did rum. So the last 4 that we need to cover so that you guys have everything that you need to know. You'll have all the information that's in my head on YouTube, so you can go back and listen to it over again. Is bourbon, which people have been clamoring for a little while.
Right.
We're going to do vodka, which is like a 2-second...
it's gonna be a commercial.
It's made vodka, and then it's over.
2 grains per.
And then we're gonna cover tequila, and we will finish out with brandies and cognacs. But we'll just dive right in and get started with bourbon. Okay. So how I've set these up is chronologically based on history and age. So the very first commercial distillery, is 1783. In Kentucky, and the time period and the proximity of this distillery is probably in a county called Bourbon.
Bourbon County?
Bourbon County.
Probably there? We're not sure?
No, because it was...
Is it too early?
We're in this time period where things are a little shaky, especially with the government tracking everything.
We were still using hieroglyphics, and we didn't even have writing at that time.
Yeah, well, they haven't started taxing everybody for this shit. People are just making products.
So there's then it's willy-nilly. It's like the Wild West.
Yeah.
You don't really know what's going on.
So, Evan Williams was the first distillery to set up in Kentucky. Now, the thing that people need to think about is that everybody thinks, oh, Evan Williams, Kentucky bourbon. The Evan Williams that was producing product at that time was probably not producing bourbon as we know it today. They're probably just making corn whiskey, which is a little bit more...
Corn whiskey, that's like the moonshine that we sell nowadays. Like the moonshine, yeah. Like, what's that brand? Midnight Moon?
Yeah,
Old Smoky?
You get the idea. It's like that, yeah. So what ends up happening is that in 1785, the county of Bourbon is put together. They finally say, oh, this is Bourbon County. Prior to that, it was just a distillery in Kentucky. Now it's a distillery in Kentucky in Bourbon County.
Where Dukes of Hazzard was.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that was Georgia. Okay.
1789, Elijah Craig is being put together. And a lot of people that really follow bourbon are looking at Elijah Craig as kind of the father into the what's the word that I'm looking for? Like the very beginning process of how bourbon's really going to start coming around. So you have...
It's like he birthed the idea of a bourbon?
Yeah, I mean, he put together like the very first real recipes. So Evan Williams is the first corn commercial distillery, corn whiskey commercial distillery. Evan Williams comes in a couple years later and is starting to put together the beginning fundamentals of what will then become bourbon. Now, nothing is bourbon yet, okay?
It's whiskey.
It's just whiskey.
It's something that's a brown
It's just corn whiskey. Now we're going into 1791, and we need to kind of like look at the problem with American whiskey at this point. Now, there's a couple people in Kentucky, and a majority of the distillers that are in America right now...
There's only a couple people in Kentucky.
Yeah. The rest of the distillers that are in the country right now are living in Pennsylvania, and they're referred to as Pennsylvania Dutch, but that's not really true. They're not Pennsylvania Dutch, they're Pennsylvania Deutsch, which is... German. So they're German...
Why do they call them Pennsylvania Dutch then?
Because it was a mistake. They thought Deutsch was Dutch. Yeah. Okay. So these German settlers that are living in Pennsylvania are producing rye, and they're producing so much rye that for every one American, they were producing a half a barrel of whiskey.
So then the Americans were drunk.
Yeah.
Or they just had an overstock of whiskey.
Well, no, they were just selling rye. Rye was predominantly the American spirit. It was the first spirit to really be the American spirit, and it was the spirit that everybody was drinking in the colonies. Okay? So...
What about apple cider?
I mean, you have that, but I'm talking about spirit.
Like
the first spirit.
When they really want to get hardcore, and they're not scraping ice off their cider in the wintertime.
Yeah. Distillery. Now we're going to walk into the Whiskey Rebellion and the explanation of what's taking place here. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 is a time period where we've just got done fighting the Revolutionary War. We have a bunch of distilleries. We need to pay for the war that we just fought. The government says, it's about time that you pay tax on the alcohol that you're making, and all hell breaks loose.
Right.
Now, Pennsylvania is predominantly where this war is taking place because all the distillers are in Pennsylvania. The end result of this is that a bunch of them are pretty much made to where they're not able to keep producing product, and in return, the American government goes, well, we're really sorry that we had this big war, and we're going to make it up to you, because what we're going to do is we're going to give you land in Kentucky for you to move to and live, and this is our gift to you. Now, the thing was that they had hundreds of acres of land, right?
But what do you mean give it to them? They couldn't have just went there?
Well, no, you got to follow the idea here. The American government was really sneaky and smart in this. So they knew that they were already distillers, right?
Right.
So they go down to Kentucky. They only were allowed to plant corn. So when they planted corn, they had to plant the entire 100 acres of corn, knowing that no human could produce that. There was going to be a surplus. Yeah. That was then going to be turned into alcohol. They would get the taxation from what they just gave away.
So their goal was, I'm going to give you real estate to make me money.
Yeah.
So you're getting the real estate for free, although you could have really taken it.
Yeah.
And in return of getting that for free, you're going to make stuff, and then we're going to ask for some money for it.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a loan. I'm giving you land, and you're going to pay me back with taxes and money later.
Yeah. So
that's fair.
The federal government goes into the Whiskey Rebellion, and we're now down in Kentucky with the rye producers that are now the beginning stages of bourbon producers. And one of those families that kind of comes into its being in 1795 is the Jim Beam family.
This guy, because it says 1795 right on the back.
Yep.
So is this corn?
Yeah, that is a corn whiskey.
Wow.
Well, it's a bourbon, but yeah.
Where's our Jack Daniels?
Well, you're getting ahead of yourself here, okay? So the Beam family is really coming into its own based on the fact that it's kind of putting in the beginning stages of what's known today as sour mash. Yeah. Now, a lot of people get really confused with sour mash. They think that it is something special.
I know. It's you take the mash.
Yep.
You use a lot of it, and then you recycle some of it back in the other one.
Okay.
Does that make any sense?
Do you know why you do that, though?
Yeah, it's cost savings, big time. No, I'm guessing that there's something left over that they want to be able to reuse again.
Okay. The
yeast.
In the mash, okay, mash has a interesting thing during the fermentation process. It can go one of two ways. It can either go alcohol or it can go vinegar.
You don't want vinegar.
You don't want vinegar.
Unless you want to make pickles.
But to keep it from going vinegar, the easiest way to keep that from happening is by having mash that already said, oh, I'm going to become alcohol. And putting that with the other mash, it then equalizes your fermentation and turns it into, I'm going to become alcohol.
Right, so sort of like what you do with the beer, you make a starter yeast and then you can use it to make other beer.
Yeah.
And then you keep doing it.
But by doing that, it regulates your product to where you get a consistent fermentation.
And you have to keep doing it.
Yeah.
There's no stopping. Whoa.
Little
scared the crap out of me.
Okay, so the sour mash process is something that everybody uses in Kentucky.
All right. Don't like the name, sour.
Well, they don't use the title on their bottles. But that act of regulation to give you a consistent fermentation is something that everybody does. Right. But the Beam family is kind of like the first foray into that. Okay?
Is that a four-way?
Yeah. So we're in the Beam family. We're in Kentucky. We've got distillers down there. Everybody up in Pennsylvania is pretty much gone at this point. A very important time period in this journey is 1807, because the steamboats are now produced.
So they can move down the river and move product.
They can move product. Now, something that we need to think about is
they don't
that
have refrigeration either.
We have a very hard time with alcohol where we're constantly thinking that everything, no matter what age period it came from, is in a bottle. That's not the case.
Oh, it's in a... This is where barrel aging comes in.
Okay. So barrels...
I know something!
...are the means of transportation to the bars. So when you would buy from Jim Beam prior to the early 1800s, you're actually buying the full barrel.
But isn't in the bar and you have to go there to get it?
Yeah, you'd go to the bar and they would distribute it out. A lot of times, remember that recipe that we tried that one time where you added water and you added grain alcohol to it? That was from a booklet of how bartenders should treat their barrels that come in off of the boats.
Okay. So
they were cutting them to make them last longer.
Right, but somebody already bought that, or did they not buy it until they actually brought it into the bar?
No. They buy it with unadulterated or sometimes adulterated, because there was no government regulation to. Right. So like Jim Beam could make 2 barrels and cut it and make it into 3 or 4.
Right, and then you trade those 2 or 3 and you make double your money.
Yeah, because the government at this time isn't regulating the product. They're just like. They just give us the tax, you know?
We don't care what you do, just give us a tax until people start bitching, then we'll worry about it.
Exactly. So, I think we're all on the same page. We're making alcohol, it's not going into bottles, it's going into barrels, and it's getting shipped by steamboat. Okay. 1808, the beginning of kind of the production of transportation from Kentucky to the rest of the country is like setting up this distribution network that's going into place. And in 1821, the bourbon advertising starts to begin. They start to roll out advertising for bourbon.
Which would be the next natural progression of consumer or products, or what do they call it? The economy.
Yeah, and the first advertisement was printed in the Western Citizen newspaper in Paris, Kentucky. So they weren't like going really far out there. It wasn't like New York City or Boston.
Right. But it's advertising in general. It's a new thing, so it's got to start somewhere.
Yeah. The first legal documentation of the sour mash process being trademarked happens in 1818.
Well, that's a long time after these guys started making this, huh?
Yeah. So the person that's going to claim the beginning stages of this is the Pepper Distillery. Now, the Pepper Distillery is really interesting because being such an early distillery, it no longer is called by its original name. It's now called Woodford Reserve Distillery.
I have one of those.
Yep.
Someplace up there.
Yep. So the Pepper Distillery becomes Woodford, and they have now trademarked sour mashing.
So once it's trademarked, nobody else can use this process.
Well, not
paying them. No, that's a patent.
Yeah. Okay. So the sour mashing's in. We've got the mode of transportation. Advertising starts to kick off. 1826 is the earliest known mention of charring of barrels. Okay, and where that comes from is a Lexington grocer had sent a correspondence letter to a distiller by the name of John Crowles, and John had said the grocer had said in the correspondence that the barrels are burnt on the inside, say only 1/16 of an inch, then the whiskey will be much more improved. That was the correspondence.
So let's do that.
So prior to this, for almost little less than about 100 years, the mode of transportation has been barrels, but it's been uncharred barrels. So it looks a little more like Scotch at this point than it does like bourbon. And now we're moving into the time period where they are able to finally start churning that into bourbon with the charring of barrels. Okay?
And then when they moved those barrels down the river, they ended up getting that oak and smoothing them out. So they were
the time period, the longer that they're on the ship, like if they're going back to London, and they're going to take a barrel, the length of that journey would cause it to be a much better whiskey
Right.
than if we were delivering it.
And thus you learn, hey, to make better whiskey, it needs to be in a barrel longer, but now you can just leave it at the distillery and let it age if you want to.
Yep.
Because why should we let all the people in Scotland have good whiskey when we should be getting the good whiskey, but we're too close?
Well, at this point, Scotland wasn't the prestige to be. It was Irish whiskey. It was actually prestige. But, okay. So, although bourbon whiskey had been distilled in Old Bourbon County for decades, it's not until 1840 that it officially becomes known as bourbon, okay? Prior to this, everything was labeled as Bourbon County whiskey or Old Bourbon County whiskey. Okay? So, we're now in 1861 to about 1865, and we have a wonderful thing. What happens during that time period? You should know this.
1861?
Yeah.
They invented the brothel.
Ugh. No.
Civil War.
Civil War.
They had brothels already.
So the Civil War is going to cause a shortage of whiskey.
Because everybody needs to drink it.
Well, twofold. The rations are put up from the north and the south for the use of the military because they need for the troops to feed them and stuff like that. And the other thing is that a lot of those factories were taken over to be used for manufacturing of munitions for both sides. Okay, so the leftover, about 25 distilleries that are still kind of running in the north are being taken over for those uses, and the Kentucky distillers that are down in the south are being taken over for the Confederate Army. So
it just doesn't make any sense. Why would they need the building or what do they use? Do they need the manpower, the people, the building?
Yeah, they would just use the factories for production of ammunitions.
I guess it's better than doing it outside.
Yeah. Okay, so now we get into the beginning of the period of Brown and Forman. Okay, 1870 is the beginning of Old Forester. Now, the gentleman that started Mr. Brown, that started Brown and Forman, is revolutionary in the sense that at this point they're building the product, they're putting it into the barrel, and when they sell the barrel, they sell that one barrel.
Right.
Okay, so the product's consistency is like all over the fucking place. Like, some of it's light, some of it's dark. Anybody that's really into bourbon and has tasted single barrels, from the same line, say, oh, that's much different than the other one.
Right.
Okay?
It's a seasonal.
Yeah. So the barrels each give off a different personality, and the way that you get around that is by blending together to get a consistent product.
Right.
Old Forester was the first company to figure out that blending together was how they were going to get a consistent product.
So then I just needed a master blender that says this. Because you can't drop it onto a machine and go, it's consistent. You need somebody to actually go, this tastes like this other one. Maybe they have the other one.
Yeah, use a little bit more of this,
right.
Use a little less of that.
But the next time they do it, it could be a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, a little bit less of that. It could always be different.
The other thing that was kind of interesting about George Brown was that he also was he sold pharmaceuticals prior to being
Big Pharma.
Yeah, in the alcohol business. And he kind of realized that by selling the barrels to the liquor stores and to the grocery stores, that it made people feel very uneasy about the products that they were buying because they knew that they could be adulterated. Okay? Mm-hmm. So his idea at this point was to put them into a glass bottle. It was much harder to tamper with a glass bottle that came out of the factory than it would be just a barrel.
And you can usually see it.
Yeah. So he's the very first person to sell his product out of glass.
And I'm guessing they're larger than this.
I
mean, why wouldn't you ship them in big glass? I mean, you're going from a barrel to a glass. You're
I think
going the opposite direction.
We've kind of always. I can't give you a definitive answer on this, but I think it's the wine standard. Wine is 700 or is it 750 also?
750.
Yeah. So it's kind of like universal. They've already had a bunch of wine bottles, so switching over to using the wine glass bottles for spirits purposes is probably not that much of a change up.
Unless you want to keep it clear, which most wine isn't clear because it's just not.
Okay, so bottled in glass, blending, all those things are covered, right? So now we're going to move into 1879 and the warehousing. Now, at this point, the warehousing of the barrels is kind of like all over the place. It's just a mess. And the wonderful person, Frederick Stitzel, comes up with the ingenious idea of building wooden racks for the barrels to sit on. He's the person that invents the rack house. Now, the interesting thing I want you guys to kind of keep note on is the time period for this and the fact that he's the person that invented the racks. He trademarked and patented the rack system.
Okay.
Okay?
So you should still be getting paid today?
Just follow me on this.
I'm following.
This is in 1879 at the beginning of Stitzel-Weller.
Okay.
So now we're into the home stretch of where everything's going to kind of all come together. Okay, so 1897, the Bottled and Bond Act is the government's first step to try to finally set a limit on what alcohol is, okay? It was the federal standards to finally set standards of identity for distilled spirits. It was their way of saying, we're sick of seeing people get poisoned by stuff that's not really alcohol.
Right.
We want to make sure that this is 100% alcohol based upon what the standards of identity are, okay?
Right. So a bourbon has got to have a name, and it's going to have.
Bourbon
to
at this
told
point
what
is
it
now 51% corn, okay, with the remainder being having to be a cereal grain, okay.
Like Captain Crunch.
No, like wheat, rye, maize, rice, just a cereal grain, okay.
Got it.
The end result of the standardization is that the government kind of got into the act of regulating in a way that was going to be beneficial to them. The reason for that is that there was a guy that was helping put together this bill, and he owned the largest property of American oak.
So nothing changes. The guy making the laws is also the one
Who's going to
making
benefit.
the profit.
Yeah. So he sets into the law that America can only produce bourbon using a brand new charred oak barrel.
From a guy that can make them.
Strange, huh?
Yeah.
So since 1897, we've been stuck with this stupid law that every bourbon has to be made using a brand new barrel. So every time we get done with those barrels,
We can find a place for them.
well, there's people that need them.
Right.
Scotland takes them for a very discounted rate and uses them.
And Yale.
Tequila uses them, and the rum producers use them.
Right.
So all of these guys are getting all of our barrels for like
What
nothing.
about cognac?
Cognac uses French oak.
French people.
Yeah. So
They had the same problem over there. Like, oh, you're to use French oak from me.
yeah. So standards of identity. The government steps in. They're finally saying what everything is and what the classification is. 1909. William Taft steps in, Mr. Taft, president,
I
and
remember him.
he pushes in the identification, which will then start moving America from rye production into bourbon production. He is the guy that kind of like moves to classify the terms for bourbon, classify the terms for rye, and pushing corn as the dominant grain in our culture. He had kind of pushed the Agricultural Society and the Corn Growers Association to like make rye go away.
Again, political agenda.
Yeah. So we're now in the 1900s, and it's 1935, and most people that are really crazy about bourbon are like nuts about Pappy Van Winkle. Pappy Van Winkle has been working for Stitzel-Weller for about 60 years, and he started as like a door-to-door salesman for Stitzel-Weller. He like moved into the factory, and like now he's 60 years old and he's running the factory. Okay? So
Took long enough.
from 1935 to 1966, Pappy Van Winkle is running Stitzel-Weller. So there's something that you as collectors of bourbon need to think about. If you buy a 25-year-old bourbon, or a 25-year-old Pappy Van Winkle, there's no possible way that Pappy Van Winkle was the one that distilled it, because he passed away in 1966.
70, 80, 90. So, what would happen to the bourbon after? Oh, because there wasn't any.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So nowadays they are using Stitzel-Weller product to
using
blend
his name.
with Buffalo Trace product and calling it Pappy Van Winkle.
because that's the only way they can make a brand. Well, it's sort of like Atari, right? Atari was once really cool. Now there's a company called Atari that's not really have anything to do with the original Atari, and everybody buys games and go, "Oh, these are from Atari." No, they're just from a guy who bought the name. Same deal. They have a name.
Well, it's still in the family. Julian Van Winkle is still running the Pappy name, and they have an agreement with Buffalo Trace.
It's not, it's Buffalo.
Yeah, but it's something to think about because I've seen a lot of people that are really crazy about bourbons that are like, oh, this is a Pappy Van Winkle, and it is by name,
right?
But it's not by
It depends if for some reason that year was a really good bourbon. Great, you have it. But if you're looking for it from being touched by the hands of Pappy, then it would.
Doesn't exist anymore. I mean, there's some collectors that have stuff like that. But you'd be very hard pressed to find an original Pappy Van Winkle.
And it would be something you see on Pawn Stars.
Yeah. Okay, so that distillery, Stitzel Weller, after Pappy dies, it still keeps running up until I believe the 80s. Don't quote me on that.
Quote him.
And the company was bought out by Diageo. And
by everybody.
Diageo came in there and closed the place down, and they've taken over the rack houses. So now Diageo is doing a program called the Orphan Barrel, and what they're doing is they are picking up the lost barrels at Stitzel Weller and using those barrels because everybody from the major manufacturers stores their barrels at Stitzel Weller because it's so enormous. Right. Okay, so when a manufacturer forgets or they close down that they have those barrels there, those barrels then become the property of Diageo. So Diageo is going to be able to run an entire portfolio of these boutique bourbons just based on the leftovers that are at their distillery.
But they can never be made again.
No.
So it's like ultra rare.
Yep.
But do they even know what it really is?
Yeah, they know exactly what it is.
Who registered and who the.
But they don't promote it as the original producer. They give it new names. Like the first one was called Old Blowhard, and then the second one was called
Are they named after
Barter House. No, not they just.
No, well, they're named after the personalities of the people who want to work.
They just give them Blowhard. Yeah, they just give them new names, and then the last one was like Relic or something like that. But the important part is that because the original founder came up with the patent for rack housing, they didn't purchase the distillery because they wanted it for use.
Right, they bought the patent.
They bought the patent. So everybody that uses racking now owes money to Diageo for racking.
Which is pretty much how all the tech companies work anyway.
Yeah.
One company buys another because they want the IP, not because they care about who's there.
Stitzel Weller was an IP thing, but if you become really passionate about bourbon, you really get into bourbon, Stitzel Weller is like the holy grail. It has a lot of what influenced today's bourbon came out of that distillery. And, if you're, I love Pappy Van Winkle, love how it tastes, well, then you have to love Stitzel Weller, So, okay, so we did the Stitzel Weller talk and the Pappy talk. 1964, America finally flips the bird to rye whiskey and makes bourbon its American spirit.
Well, what happens to this Sazerac?
What do you mean?
That's rye whiskey, isn't it?
Yeah, but
that's all I had to go on.
At this point in our country, really the only producer left is Old Overholt. And Old Overholt has moved production long before this from Pennsylvania to Kentucky. So if you want to buy like a rye whiskey, you would only buy Old Overholt.
Why is there no rye?
Because the Corn Growers Association has kind of been edging out rye ever since the very beginning of this process.
How do you actually stop somebody from making rye?
You don't. You just overwhelm them by taking up all their market share. You just get to a point to where a product becomes redundant. Like the people in Pennsylvania weren't going to keep up with Kentucky. Kentucky had already been edging themselves with the government and with marketing. At the end of this, there was just nothing left.
Right.
People weren't buying the product, so there was no reason to keep the doors open. So
sounds like Walmart.
This process takes place. Bourbon's now the American spirit based upon appellation. 1984, Blanton's releases its first single barrel. So the very first single barrel in the bourbon market is released by Blanton's. Now, the thing to think about is that in this process of becoming a bourbon, marketing, distribution, federal regulation, all of these things, we really are selling only two types of bourbon at this point. We're selling straight bourbons and blended bourbons. The
sort of like
act of doing this has really put bourbon kind of on the bottom shelf.
Because it's all blended? But single barrel's not bad.
Yeah, but that's the thing is that 1894 is the time period where the whole market takes a churn, and it makes the decision that by making exclusive products like single barrels and small batch products, that they're able to make it more premium. Okay.
Well, you've made the supply less.
Yeah.
Because you're not blending it.
Yep.
So you're not stretching it out. You only need it. Small batch just basically means I'm not going to make a lot of it, so screw you.
Yeah.
Or I don't want to because it's too costly or whatever. But you end up with like bitters.
Yeah.
Small batch bitter.
So this is 1984 is really the churn. Okay. So 1988. The people over at Booker's, Jim Beam, Fred No comes out with kind of like the very first sword in the ground premium bourbon with Booker's. And that is the very first small batch bourbon.
And that's the same people that make this?
Yep.
So how many companies are there? Like 4? And then they all just make new labels of everything?
Well, like the big families, you have Heaven Hill.
Who's Jack Daniels then?
That's Brown and Foreman. Okay, so
right, that's right.
Heaven Hill, Brown and Foreman, Sazerac, which is Buffalo Trace, okay, and then Jim Beam, and Four Roses. There's a couple other little producers in there. I'm just trying to think if I'm leaving anybody out. No, that's a micro.
Okay.
But,
you said major, right.
Yeah, but the major Kentucky distillers at this point are...
But you can't tell when you buy something whether it's like, what is this rye one, right?
That's Jim Beam.
Right, so you're buying all these products thinking they're completely like small niche brands, and it's just some other company that is huge that is producing the product.
Yeah, I mean, the things that you have to think about with this is it's not just complicated in the fact of knowing that Jim Beam and R1 are the same. That's not the only thing that makes it difficult. The other thing that's really difficult is that the producers of these products are not always producing the products themselves.
They contract them out. Or they buy them already done.
So, in Jim Beam's case, that R1 is actually produced by Jim Beam. Okay? There's a couple other manufacturers that their rye whiskeys are all contracted. So it's starting to become a thing where if you're really into bourbon, you understand the history, you understand the mashing and the distillation process, and that all makes sense to you. You then start getting really nerdy and start studying the origins of these
so you
bottles.
Right, trace them all down and figure out what they got.
And you start figuring out, like if this is produced at a certain distillery, like a big, massive, distillery, these products all kind of have the same characteristics.
And then the tequila problem.
Yeah.
Same thing with Nom IDs. And
the best thing from a common man going into bourbon, wondering what I should buy, is that your rye whiskeys are 51% rye at minimum, okay? And your bourbons are 51% corn at minimum. And the quality of those bourbons is all universally same. Like the American government is not letting crappy products come out because of the standardization. Mm-hmm. There's certain things that are making it to where it's really good product compared to the product that was coming out 100 years ago.
Right.
The end result of that is that you can't buy bad bourbon right now. You can just buy bourbon that is not as good as other bourbons. But
so like Jack Daniels versus Maker's Mark, you don't even know first off if they're the same
Well, it's a little different. It's different because with Jack Daniels, that is a Tennessee whiskey.
Okay, so it's like coal filtering.
Yeah, it's charcoal filtered, which is going to make it much lighter than the Maker's Mark. But if you take Jack Daniels out of the equation, because that's the hair in the saddle, okay? and you look at just strictly bourbons, if it says bourbon on the bottle, and you try those against each other, you're going to start to figure out what you like in that category. Like, I think that a good example of that is tasting Buffalo against Maker's Mark. They're both excellent products.
Right.
And you can't lose out by buying both of these bottles. There's no money loss in buying a Maker's Mark or a Buffalo Trace.
Right. You're not going to buy it and be like, man, I wish you would have bought the other product instead.
Yeah. And these are relatively inexpensive as far as bourbons go. And at the end of the day, like, if it sits on your shelf for 10 years, Buffalo Trace is still an amazing product. At some point, somebody's going to see that and be like, oh, Buffalo Trace, I want some of that.
Right.
Like, you're never going to go wrong by having those two products. So if you're going to, like, you want to get into the market, you want something that's inexpensive for your college bar, then you go Jim Beam. Okay?
But why is that more inexpensive if they're all based on...
Because they're producing so much of it,
right.
it brings down the cost of production.
Yeah, it's just quantity.
It's the most produced bourbon in Kentucky. Jim Beam is making more white label bourbon than anybody else is making their bourbons. Okay?
Which would then reduce the cost.
Yeah.
It's moving on. And they've...
Exactly. If you're older, you have a good paying job, you're not like, oh, I'm going to run out of money this week. Makers and Buffalo Trace are the next good step. Now, you get bourbons down, you're like, oh man, I really like bourbons. Bourbons are awesome. It's very important to buy a bottle of rye whiskey. Now, my suggestion is that you either buy Wild Turkey.
That's rye?
Wild Turkey sells a rye.
Oh, yeah. It's got the labels a little bit.
Yeah. R1, which is great rye whiskey. Or you get into...
My bullet.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be like my starting suggestion for, like, I'm just starting out rye.
Oh, yeah. That's, like, really expensive.
Yeah. Let me think.
If I remember correctly.
I would say...
This is probably the more cost-effective.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think if there's another rye that I would throw in that category, but it's not important. This is going to be like a 2-hour episode if we just keep going, so... I think that pretty much covers everything. Let's see if anybody's got anything that they were looking at.
Oh, good luck. I see smiley faces in the live chat.
Okay. I think that pretty much covers bourbon. You got any questions, Derek, that I can cover?
I think
for
I
you?
answered most of them. I guess the end result is that the key here is that if you're buying something, you're not going to go wrong. The question, the Tennessee whiskey thing's always out there, but you're really looking at buying a product that you kind of almost like the label to at some point, because you don't know. If you don't know what you're getting, you pick one up, they're all going to be fairly good.
Yeah.
I personally would pick Buffalo Trace over a Jack Daniels like product or a Jim Beam. I don't know why. It's a little bit harsher. Not harsher like bad, it's just different.
Yeah.
These are a little bit smooth, have a little bit more oak to them, so the profiles are slightly different. And there's a lot of complicated reasons as to why. So you can't just say, I'm going to go with this and this is the best thing I'm ever going to have, because you may find another bourbon out there that you have never had.
I've tasted so many bourbons and so many single barrels. And it's like Buffalo Trace, for instance. I've tasted so many barrels of Buffalo Trace that people are never going to taste, that we were looking at for small batch production. Right. That it's very interesting that if you're really into bourbons, there's no end that you can take yourself to. Like, you could spend $1 billion and still never taste everything that's available to you.
Right. And some of it becomes rare and you'll miss it.
Yeah.
So you got to keep drinking all the time.
Yeah, and then there's the big thing now is like older bourbons. They're getting into like 15 and 20-year-old bourbons. And honestly, the production of bourbon is not meant to be treated like Scotch. Scotch has the availability, because of the second use barrel,
right,
to be matured for a very long period of time without inflecting a lot of flavor and profile into that product. Because bourbon is using a brand new barrel, that 20 years in barrel just makes it fucking really tough to drink.
Is it too oaky and buttery?
There's certain companies that have used barrels that like were bad barrels that like weren't working to begin with, and that's fine.
Right.
But then like you have certain manufacturers that just want to put out old product, and like it just is, it's very difficult to drink. It's very astringent.
It takes a long time for them to know that too, because they're gonna have to sit there and rest it for 20 years.
Yeah.
All right. So there you go. A little bit on the bourbon trail. Question of the day: what's your favorite bourbon? And if you don't have one, tell us why you haven't had bourbon yet.
Okay.
And whiskeys and all that good stuff. And that's it.
We're teaching
done.
you how to drink bourbon.
Woo!